So let's just start super simple with explaining what an algorithm is, what it's used for, and then how we build learning algorithms, and then how our neural networks are an algorithm that learn and how they're, maybe categorically different than other algorithms that we're probably more familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, so algorithms, let's say, or computer programs, they're just steps that you program that you tell a computer how to solve a particular problem. So they all start with taking some information, and then you tell them how to translate that information into an answer. And so if you think of things like doing long division, when you were learning that at primary school, there was an algorithm to that. There was some steps you had to follow, and depending on whether you had you had to move something over to one column, or whether you had a remainder, you had to make some choices, but you were following a basic algorithm. Basically, a computer program encodes some of those things that can be way more sophisticated than solving long division problems, and can, help us in business and in our everyday lives. And that's basically the foundations of the internet and social media, and the applications you have on your computer are all just lots of algorithms stitched together in a sort of coherent and meaningful way to solve problems. And then, well, I guess learning algorithms are slightly different. They're still the same. There's still a load of steps, but the difference is a learning algorithm is not programmed by a human being anymore. They're translated usually from some sort of set of constraints. It's usually data from an existing problem. So you say, this is a problem we've solved many, many times. What we're going to do, instead of getting a human programmer to program the steps for us, we're going to take that data and we're going to use machine learning to come up with the algorithm for us, rather than having a person do it. That's kind of useful in a lot of situations. So there's most software, we don't actually need to use learning at all. You're actually much better off to get a person to program it. But some programs, it turns out it's really difficult to write an algorithm that does things. And so to give you an example, just of recognizing basic images, basic objects in an image. So there's this well-known paradox, Matt. I don't know if you've heard of it, Moravec's paradox.
No.
You ever heard of it? So Moravec's paradox. Moravec was an artificial intelligence researcher, and probably in about the 1960s or 70s, him and other people recognized that. So initially in artificial intelligence, what people thought was, well, we'll come up with algorithms that can do basic things like a child, and then we'll build them up so they can do things doing like playing chess and solving mathematical problems. And it turned out in the paradox was that it was much easier to build algorithms that could play chess like a grand champion and to solve complex mathematical problems than it was to do basic things like understand speech and identify images, which is what children are really good at. And it just turns out it's very hard to program something to say, oh, this is what a cup looks like and this is what a dog looks like. It's very hard because they can occur from lots of different angles, and there's no one property that makes a cup, except maybe that you can put stuff in it. But it's, cups can be different sizes and different shapes, and they can have handles, and even just basic stuff like that. It turns out it's very difficult to hand program that. It's actually easier to give 1,000 examples of cups and get an algorithm to learn what a cup is, and it comes up with some messy program at the end that nobody can really understand what that program's doing, how that program does it. We can just send it examples of cups to check that it's behaving, and it's not just cups. It's doing forecasting of stock in your business. You have to think of a lot of different parameters and how important they are, and it turns out it's probably easier to learn that than it is to sit down and program it out by hand for a lot of those problems, which is why machine learning has been very successful in sort of just doing business operations stuff.
So there's a lot of really great videos online that explain neural networks and sort of how they create these patterns to identify things. But I'd like you to give your explanation, give your take on it as well. Just get us primed here. My understanding is basically you have a string of data. However, that data you form is just some values, some numbers, and then it goes and all of those data feed into each neuron of the neuron, which is its own separate function, and transforms it in some way to get one output, takes all the data, all those numbers, and gets one number. But then you have tons of neurons, each one doing this calculation, and then the pattern repeats and repeats, and you get all these different numbers, and they're constantly changing and creating patterns. And cool, okay, I understand how it works, but I don't understand how it works, like how you get the results that you're actually expecting to get from creating these unique patterns.
Yeah, I mean that's you're not alone there, right? I mean, even the biggest experts in the world don't quite understand why these things work. And there's a subgroup of this that looks at the theory behind neural networks and tries to understand when do they work, why do they work, and when are they going to fail. Yeah, so if you think about, let's go back to the start of sort of neural networks in computing, which was actually 1944. Two researchers, McCulloch and Pitts. One was a cognitive scientist, one was a mathematician. I forget which one was the cognitive scientist. They proposed a small model for how the neurons in a human brain would work. And they showed that you could learn what are called these Boolean functions, that you could learn Boolean functions from data from these things. And so I think this is reasonably impressive when you think back. This was the first computers in the world had been built, but nobody really knew about them because they were being used to decode stuff in the war effort. So they were all private. So nobody knew about computation, but these people invented artificial neural networks before computers had evolved. And so fast forward from 1944 to today, that's nothing like what a human brain looks like. We know that now. That's what they thought it might look like in 1944, but that's still the model we have now. So as you said, it makes decisions in an entirely different way to we do. There's still people who will run around saying, oh, they're built like the human brain, therefore we'll be able to replicate human intelligence with them, but they're really nothing like the human brain, but they can be very useful nonetheless. And so, yeah, the way to think about it probably at an abstract level is, instead of having one algorithm to learn some stuff, you actually have one machine learning algorithm. You actually have a stack of them on top of each other. And are you familiar with the term deep learning?
Sure.
Must have come across that. Yep.
I don't know how to distinguish necessarily between machine learning and deep learning, but
yeah. So that deep learning is a type of machine learning, and deep means not that what it's learning is deep, but that's deep means actually it's just a stack of these things on top of each other. Therefore, you can have them deeper or more shallow. And so in about the 1970s, the model that was of neural networks at the time was just this, what we call one layer perceptrons. And Marvin Minsky was a researcher, and he wrote a famous paper that showed that these were limited and they weren't going to solve all the problems everybody thought. But then researchers had the idea to basically put these things on top of each other. And basically each layer in a deep learning network, in an artificial, there's one big artificial neural network. Each layer is responsible for doing basically one thing. So if you think about recognizing images, that first layer is responsible for taking the pixels and sort of identifying all the pixels around it, and does this come up with a coherent group of pixels that might be useful. And each one of the neurons in that layer is responsible for doing one thing, like recognizing a particular color, for example, is one of the things that they do quite well. And then as you go like down the layers, in an image network, they kind of start grouping the pixels together until you go down a certain number of layers, depending on how you design it, to the point where, say, the second to bottom layer is identifying what we would consider to be concepts, like parts of an image that is meaningful to a human being. And that's a lot of research that I've done with my PhD student, Raihan Zhang, is how can we extract the concepts that a neural network is learning at this level, and are they meaningful to people? And so those bottom layers are effectively, it's basically saying, well, this group of pixels here, that kind of looks like something, that's an important concept that I've learned. The neural network has no idea what that concept is. To us, it might look like the handle of a cup, but it's just saying like that sort of crescent shape, and that I see that a lot, and that seems to be somehow related to this thing that we call cup, and it will identify these different things. And then that last layer basically is just like any other machine learning layer, effectively, that says, well, if I put all these concepts together, and so there's like different weights on them, like that's clearly a cup, that's clearly a cup handle that's really strong. This other thing over here that looks like it might be writing on the side, it's not quite sure. It puts all these things together to produce an answer. But effectively at each one of those layers, you have one of these little neurons that's just responsible for looking at usually one thing. So in that case, it might be the handle of that cup. It gets a signal in that says, here's something that looks like this shape here. Is that a handle of a cup or not? And it will, if it reaches a certain level of, let's say, confidence, it says yes and sends a signal through to the next layer down. So as you go down the layer, basically what it's doing is piecing together, in an image recognizer, it's piecing together different pixels. And as you move down and down, it's trying to sort of coalesce them into more meaningful, I would call them concepts. Each one of those layers is responsible for doing one of those things, and each neuron is responsible for just looking out for one particular thing. here. And so what you end up with is a really big layer with lots of these neurons and really big network with several layers, lots of neurons across the layer. So usually the more you put, the better it can do at these tasks. Pulls them all together. And so each one of these neurons is responsible for looking at one particular function, at one particular part of an image. And that's why it becomes so hard to understand what's going on, because you don't really know. It's just saying it's grouping these things together. It's very hard to think about what is it actually identifying. That's part of what the work that we've been doing. What is it actually identifying, and how does it work? So, most experts, I mean, if you show them a neural network, the best expert in the world couldn't tell you what it's doing in the slightest. If you show them, in this one, it's recognizing an image of a cup, explain how it does it. They would say, yeah, I simply can't explain that. There's just too much complexity in there. And so that's the sort of one of the grand challenges is how can we understand what these things are doing? Can we verify they're doing things correctly, for example?